So it's really lovely to be with you today. I hope everybody has their coffee. This is not going to be a super formal presentation, but Jeffrey Perlman reached out and asked me if I could put some thoughts together. And so hopefully this will be helpful for folks in just sort of stepping back and looking at what we've been seeing across the work that we do and the clients that we work with, which gives us sort of an interesting perspective both across hazards, so thinking about flooding and sea level rise and heat and precipitation and sort of the full range of climate impacts, but also across modes, across geographies, and then through the different lenses. So whether it's the lens of people who are building out electrification infrastructure, or the lens of utilities who are working with communities, or the lens of state and local clients, whether it's a city or an MPO or a state DOT, and then the work that we do working with federal agencies, so federal highways among them, but EPA, DOE, all thinking about this increasingly interconnected and interdependent suite of critical services. So with that, I think I will, I think Melissa is checking the slides for me. So thank you, Melissa. We'll skip over me and we can go to that. Okay, there we go. So so this is probably something that many of you have already seen, but just sort of as a way to stage set. This information comes from the 2020 New Jersey Scientific Report on Climate Change. There are obviously their national reports, but the ones that are local to your area are the ones that often have the most useful and usable information. So this is published in 2020, and it just provides a quick overview of some of the examples of the kinds of impacts that you might expect for New Jersey. So sea level rise, that's assuming a moderate emission scenario. You're looking at sea level rise having a 50% chance of reaching 1.4 feet by 2050 and 3.3 feet by 2100. And that's obviously there's scenarios involved in that, but this is just sort of a snapshot. The heat waves we've been seeing throughout the country, especially the Pacific Northwest recently, but heat waves are expected to impact larger areas with more frequency and importantly, longer duration by 2050. I'll talk about longer duration in a minute. Floods, the size and frequency of floods, you've already seen, we expect that will increase as annual precipitation increases. I know you've already been doing some studies looking into this. Temperature increases, so New Jersey is warming faster than the rest of the Northeast region and the world, which was actually surprising for me to read. Annual precipitation in New Jersey is expected to increase by 4% to 11% by 2050. And the issue with precipitation is that it's not about how much precipitation, it's when you have the precipitation and whether the precipitation follows a drought, et cetera. Air quality, so climate change is likely to increase air pollution, which has the probability of increasing some respiratory and cardiovascular health problems, which we've all been hearing about in the news. And what I thought was interesting, I was scanning through the long range transportation planning draft over the weekend, and I noticed that you're expecting that you're going to have about a 2% increase in the percent of the population in New Jersey that'll be over 65 years by 2050. And so thinking about the importance of air quality and these high heat, the extended periods of high heat where you have no nighttime cooling off, that's really, really big issue, especially with these older and older populations, and then obviously with populations that aren't able to have, that don't have in-home cooling or access to cooling centers and things like that. So that's something that we've seen. Some of the work that we did in Philadelphia a couple of years ago was very interesting because it was, as you've probably seen in the news, it's often that first heat wave, but it's also the duration of the heat wave, because if there isn't relief, then that's when you start to see real public health impacts. You can often overcome a single high heat day, but multiple in a row is where you start to see a lot of problems, especially early in the season. And then on the left of this slide, you'll see a map of New Jersey with the expected flood risk gradient for the state. So the range, which I'm sure is nearly impossible to see on your screens, but the range of orange to dark red basically gives you some sense of the properties that, from moderate to extreme risk of flooding, which obviously is a really important issue from an economic standpoint, from a people standpoint, from a safety standpoint, and a mobility standpoint. So that's just sort of hopefully a helpful sort of stage setting, and all of this is available in that 2020 New Jersey report. Next slide. So NJTPA, I think it's important for folks on the phone to know that, from the national standpoint, NJTPA was definitely an early leader. NJTPA was one of the earliest MPOs to really kind of get into the mix, and this is years ago, more than a decade ago, when we were talking about, okay, well, what will the impacts look like? How can MPOs start to think about their role in transportation resilience? NJTPA was one of the 5 agencies to first be pilots in a federal highways climate change vulnerability assessment framework, which I actually led for federal highways. So I had an opportunity to work directly with some of the folks at NJTPA on that work. And we learned an awful lot. I mean, there were people coming to these meetings who weren't even really sure that this was something they should be working on, or why should I, as an engineer from a state DOT in fill in the blank, Iowa or Illinois or California or whatever, why should I be participating in this vulnerability study? And so interestingly, we had in San Francisco, so the San Francisco MPO was involved, the NJTPA was involved, and we had, I think, one other MPO in that early suite of studies. But you all were really, forging the sort of the cutting edge as related to undertaking these vulnerability studies. You have completed these vulnerability and adaptation studies after Irene and Sandy, partly out of necessity. Those 2 storms, came along and obviously gave us a ton of fodder for looking at not only, what should we'd be worried about in the future, but also how could we have anticipated some of these issues? How would we plan differently had we known? We had an opportunity to do a number of analyses on behalf of Federal Transit Authority or Federal Transit Administration around the same time, trying to understand, well, what could we have done more differently? What should we have been looking for in advance? How can we prepare and basically minimize the impacts of these kinds of storms in the future? You conducted these watershed level resiliency studies for the Passaic River Basin, which I'm sure many of you on the phone already are well aware of. And then, in fact, NJTPA was featured in a handbook that's been sort of on hold coming out of federal highways, which talks about how MPOs can encourage integration of resilience into transportation planning. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, because I think NJTPA has been acknowledged for attempting to integrate or to streamline, we often say streamlining, resilience into various components of the long-range transportation plan. So it's not really valuable to think about climate change over here. What's really valuable is to be thinking about, well, what projects do we have, and how do climate-related issues, in this case, extreme weather and changes in climate, whether it's flooding or precipitation or heat, how do they impact this project, and how can this project impact our ability to adapt as we experience those changes? So some of the things that were noted there are the fact that you're prioritizing transportation investments that offer additional benefits for resiliency, also for system preservation projects, upgrades and expansions, thinking about how resilience plays a role there, incorporating vulnerability and risk assessments into project development and project redevelopment, considerations, scrutinizing investments that are in places that are highly vulnerable to potential flooding or sea level rise, and then investing in alternative fuel infrastructure in support of energy independence. And that's sort of, coming from the other side, thinking about how you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. So this just gives you, swoops out, or sort of swoops up, and gives you some sort of perspective on what this looks like at a national level. And I know it's probably pretty tiny on your screens, but what's important here is that you can see Federal Highway Administration has been actively supporting transportation resilience activities across the country. And there has been support at the state DOT level, at the federal level, and then at the MPO level. So the Federal Highways has partnered with MPO state DOTs and then other federal agencies to try to undertake these resiliency pilot projects, partly to learn. I mean, partly because nobody knew the right way to do this. And we had conversations, I want to say 2008, 9, 10, just as these studies were starting. And there was a desire on behalf of some of the leadership, which was just tell them what to plan for, like tell them a number. And the reality was, we couldn't just hand out numbers and say, well, you should plan for precipitation like this, or you should plan for heat like this. Really what we needed to do was understand across modes and across climate impacts, where were there going to be sensitivities, what might some of the interdependencies be, what might some of the cascading risks be. And so these resiliency pilots have given an opportunity, each of these dots you see on the map, the triangles are the MPOs, but each of those dots on the map gives you some sense of where that place had an opportunity to look into this issue in a way that would resonate with their local stakeholders. So if flooding had been an issue, then maybe they just focused on flooding. If high heat was the biggest concern, then maybe they just focused on high heat. So it allowed for a little bit of experimentation. It also allowed for place-based sort of investigation and an opportunity to think about sort of to swoop up and to look across this suite and say, what did we learn from all of these? And so there are some guidebooks that Federal Highways is putting out in that, that reflect some of the learnings, not just the dots on the map, but also some of the other work that they've been undertaking. So 2 of these are, again, they're just like sitting, waiting in the queue to get out under the new administration. So one is integrating resilience into the transportation planning process. And the second is addressing resilience and transportation asset management. And so those 2 guidebooks, in fact, ICF supported Federal Highways in developing those. Those are available, and I'm sure that if folks on the phone are interested, we could point you to the right person at Federal Highways to see if there are draft copies or final draft copies that you could look at. And then, as I mentioned, these Federal Highways resilience pilots with DOTs and MPOs focused a lot, is over time, the lessons we were learning from those pilots led to an increased understanding of what was needed. And so 2nd and 3rd generations of pilots were able to be focused on specific things. So specifically thinking about, how do I become more durable to extreme weather? Because I'm going to expect that I'm going to have this kind of extreme weather more and more. So how do I reduce my vulnerability to that? Because right now I can't handle the full suite of impacts. I just want to think about extreme weather. Then thinking about asset specific, so asset management, extreme weather, and proxy indicators. So where we started with this sort of broad brush, what might the impacts be? There has been an increased sort of narrowing to say, this is a critical asset. What do I need to know about this asset and the condition of the asset, the age of the asset, the extent to which this asset, the design inputs and the design standards surrounding this asset and how this asset supports particular services. What are the vulnerabilities of this asset as we think about climate change? So getting really much more granular, if you will. And then thinking about the opportunities for nature-based resilience, especially for coastal highways. That's something that they've done an increasing amount of work on. And then looking at, okay, well, so now we understand the problem, we understand why we're vulnerable, what do we do about it? And that's those adaptation options. Again, not in a prescriptive way, because there's a lot of learning going on and there's a lot of balancing. I mean, at the outset of this meeting, we talked about, or the first vice chair, Bartlett, talked about these priorities that are in your long-range transportation plan. So you've got a lot you're trying to balance, health priorities, diversity, equity, mobility, accessibility. Climate change is one of them, but there's a whole lot of other, there's an awful lot of other things that are on that agenda. And so thinking about what are my adaptation options? Okay, how do those adaptation options score, if you will, against all of these other priorities? Where are you going to have opportunities for synergy where you can really achieve multiple goals? And importantly, not undermine, completion of others. Recently, the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, outlined options for federal highways to further enhance resilience of federally funded roads. So that's something that is going to come out, and I would think that would be an interesting read for those of you who are starting to think about, well, what we could be done locally. It basically, what it does is it lays out these options for federal highways to consider advancing transportation resilience at the national scale. And so they're thinking about updating design standards to account for climate change, much the way that Port Authority New York, New Jersey has done, the City of New York has done, and what the best practices might do for that, providing authoritative, actionable, and forward-looking climate information, and expanding the availability of emergency response funding for post-disaster climate resilience improvements, among other recommendations. So not just replacing in kind and then having the same thing happen again, but as you are well aware of, making sure that when you are responding post-event that you can incorporate in that response more resilient designs. Okay, next slide, Melissa. So there was an allusion earlier to some of the funding that we think is going to be coming from the federal government. Now, it's early days, and a lot of this, the sausage is definitely being made. but the FAST Act is expiring in September 2021, as you know, and there are these two bills. So the Senate bill is called the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, and in that act, basically, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act is part of the American Jobs Plan. It would authorize this $303.5 billion over 5 years to upgrade highways, roads, and bridges, with a new focus on climate change, safety, and equity. It would create new programs to address climate change with funding to reduce emissions and to modernize existing infrastructure to withstand the effects of climate change. It calls for about $18 billion in climate programs, but apropos of this conversation, it calls for about $8.7 billion to increase resilience to climate change and extreme weather, which, obviously this is still all in discussion, but that's a the specific call out is relatively new for us to see those kinds of numbers, and with a specific tag attached to climate change, extreme weather, and transportation infrastructure. And then the next is the House bill, which is called the Invest in America Act. And so the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee passed a $715 billion 5-year infrastructure bill that would allocate 50% more funding for infrastructure, and that's transportation and water, than current spending levels. And they called it the Invest in America Act. It's part of the jobs plan. It includes a designation of 1,470 projects, specific infrastructure-related projects. And it devotes something like $340 billion to roads, bridges, and safety. And this House version calls for $6.2 billion to make infrastructure resilient to extreme weather. So just, sort of, I'm laying these out not because anyone should count on them, but so that you can sort of just hear the sort of scale and the nature of these kinds of call outs that we're seeing. In the bipartisan infrastructure framework, you see there's the largest dedicated bridge investment since the construction of the interstate highway system, huge investment in EV infrastructure, which is, in an attempt to achieve the president's goal of building 500,000 EV chargers. It's the largest investment in the resilience of physical and natural systems in American history, with $47 billion in new funding for resilience. So anyway, I can share sources for all of these, but this just gives you, sort of a little bit of a sort of what do we see coming down the pike with respect to some of the possible federal funding. Okay, with that, I'd like to move to the next slide. So, Jeff had asked me if I could start to talk about, well, so what's the lay of the land, and then sort of what are we seeing from a federal standpoint, from a funding standpoint, and then what are we seeing from the standpoint of the evolution of this, this practice, basically understanding and incorporating climate change impacts and extreme weather impacts into transportation planning and design. And so I think that in a nutshell, what we're seeing is a shift from research to action, and from single hazard to multi-hazard. And so on the right, you can kind of see what I'm trying to get at there is that there was tremendous amount of research that needed to be done. I mean, very basic research, and then more sophisticated research, and just understanding where your culverts are, which I think you guys have a better handle on than many. Understanding, the condition of your bridges, understanding a number of those sort of like the very basic, what do we have? What is the climate information that we should be using? How do we overlay that climate information on the assets that we have and on the services we provide? That all had to happen in that research phase where you see climate studies, vulnerability studies, economic analyses. Again, the early days were very they were economic analyses, but they were somewhat qualitative. And then a lot of stakeholder education and engagement, partly so that you could get your hands on the data that you needed so you could do your vulnerability study. So that was sort of the first phase. And then I think what we've seen more recently has been an increased level of activity in these enhanced technical analyses. So revising design standards, as I mentioned, there's 2 great examples that are right in your backyard. Robust business cases for alternative designs and investment. I'll mention an example later. Engagement with not just with the planners, but beyond the planners, all of a sudden bringing the operations people to the table, because the operations people, they may not necessarily be focused on your climate change planning study or your vulnerability study, but they know full well at what wind speed they take a certain gate down, and they know full well, if it rains more than X, this is how I'm going to behave from an operational standpoint. So bringing those people into the conversation is so practical and so efficient, and it gets them on board, because frankly, they're very committed. They're committed to their jobs. They're committed to mobility. They're committed to safety. So bringing them in and having them be part of this discussion with engineers as well and with the finance folks, all of a sudden you have a much richer and a much more actionable set of outcomes than when we were up in the research phase. And then thinking about multi-hazard and asset-specific analyses, and then thinking about, I harp on this constantly, these interdependencies. I mean, we just, people are trying to control everything from like their phone. They are thinking about energy. They're thinking about, their connectivity to the internet. They're thinking about energy. They're thinking about their transportation. They want mobility on demand. They don't want to have to think about all of these things in vacuums. They just want it all to work seamlessly. And I think those critical services are more interconnected than ever before. So understanding how you do vulnerability studies that are not siloed to waste vulnerability, transportation vulnerability, energy vulnerability, water vulnerability. It's very important that we be thinking about, well, I don't want to create an adaptation island. So this thing, this asset might not be vulnerable, but the services it provides requires all these other assets or other systems to be operational. So I need to be thinking about that as I'm doing these studies. Otherwise, I'm investing money and I'm not going to get the outcome that I'm hoping for. And this is a big issue when we work with utilities on their resiliency programs. And then increasingly, you're starting to see people get to action. So funding availability, focusing on attracting these funds, some of the kinds that I was mentioning, but the funding that's been available through other programs, already. And then working with their stakeholders, so that the stakeholders are beginning to ask for more climate aware designs, and they're beginning to understand that, for example, there might be a reason why the sidewalk is at a different height than it was before, because it's going to make it easier for them to make sure that their business can get through this kind of a storm. Resilient redevelopment strategies are another thing that we're starting to see more and more, and then resiliency considerations in their decarbonization efforts. So, there was this sort of mindset, which is like, well, we're going to reduce emissions over here, and we're going to think about storms and extreme weather over here. Well, there's no point doing one and doing something, to reduce emissions or something to reduce vulnerability that's going to, torpedo your efforts on the other side. So trying to think about how do you, what resiliency activities could potentially reinforce your decarbonization efforts in an 80 by 50 state, or vice versa, what decarbonization activities could make it maladaptive, so make you more vulnerable, or could enhance your resilience to some of these effects that we've been talking about. All right, Melissa, next slide. So, so this is a little bit of a perspective. It sort of like reemphasizes some of the points I made on the last slide, but the National Climate Assessment, which, as I mentioned, I'm an author of that study. We reviewed 70 climate-related studies that were conducted from like 2012 to 2016 in what I would say was sort of that early phase, or relatively, maybe that was phase 2. MPOs were very important contributors to that early work, and I think that today the opportunities for MPO leadership have emerged in several key areas. So one is coordinating across jurisdictions and infrastructure types, because many of these things don't stop at jurisdictional boundaries. Capacity building and tools, you have unique opportunity there, which I think that has been used to some, to good effect in a number of places across the country. Working with stakeholders to consider the business case for alternate designs, and really bringing in, I think that MPOs do a good job of bringing in economic considerations, health considerations, and others. And so that helps when you're trying to make a business case that really is reflective of the overall priorities of a region, not just sort of, you know, one or two loud voices. And then supporting additional research, so around things like interdependencies. When I say cascading risks, it's something like a drought followed by a flood, or a wildfire followed by a flood. And then pursuing or partnering in pursuit of funding. So certainly MPOs and DOTs and, you know, federal agencies and private sector can all be working together to have effective and partnerships that I think are more successful in attracting that funding than if there's sort of a single person acting, you know, a single agency acting alone, where those interdependencies might get lost or may fall off the radar. So all this, the map on the right-hand side is just, it's a clickable map that was in the National Climate Assessment that highlights some of the different kinds of studies that were being undertaken, again, in that early phase. And what I was just pointing out here is that there was some discussion of, you know, this evolution from looking at the system sort of generically, then starting to look at specific hazards. So how is sea level rise going to impact this area? Then looking at sort of assets themselves, and then looking at some combination of specific assets and then how they contribute to the overall system. So hopefully this has been an interesting sort of overview of some of the background. Jeff had asked me to put together some thoughts about what NJTPA might consider in terms of the NJTPA's role in this area in the next couple of years. And so if you switch to the next slide, you'll see I just had a few ideas that they sort of, you know, harken back to some of the comments that I've been making. So leadership and coordination, building capacity, making the business case, continuing resilience research, and then pursuing adaptation funding opportunities, which, you know, I think might actually contribute to some of the ideas above. So with respect to this first one, this is on the right-hand side, you'll see this is just an example of how Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments is undertaking a military installation resilience review. And the reason I've included this here is because it's an example of the type of leadership and coordination that an MPO can provide. So, you know, MPOs have sort of a unique ability to convene across these various suite of stakeholders. So, but I think that MPOs in general can support the development of coordinated plans, plans of action for tackling these cross-jurisdictional, in this case, you know, flooding issues is an area where, you know, just floods don't adhere to these boundaries. And so flooding is a place where there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for leadership, providing thought leadership at the nexus of equity, mobility, and resilience planning, because that is such an important component, but not, you know, many of the people that are engaging on these topics are not as steeped in what some of the equity and environmental justice, energy justice, transportation, mobility challenges exist in particular areas. And I think MPOs have a pretty strong handle on that. So that's another place where that thought leadership, like how do we tackle vulnerability in particular areas, and to think about it through the lens of equity and mobility and accessibility of transportation, safe transportation. And then coordinating on intersectional planning. So at this intersection of health, energy, and transportation. So that's another place where we can think about resilience to the transportation, you know, system, for the transportation assets and the types of services, but we should be thinking also about the intersections with health, the intersections with energy. And I know that with public health high on your list of priorities, you know, that's another place where there might be opportunity for leadership. Okay, the next slide. Building capacity, I won't dwell on this one. I think this is an area where you actually already are, you know, NJTPA is already doing a lot of work in this area, but developing trainings and webinars, hosting peer exchanges and publications. I think sharing climate data and impacts, sharing information so people can understand what they should think when you say there's an X amount of uncertainty. What does that mean? You know, how do you translate that uncertainty into something that I, as a lay person, can then understand and process as I'm making decisions? Sharing best practices for adaptation planning, illuminating how climate resilience fits into various aspects of transportation, but the planning, the design, operations, as I mentioned, and the maintenance. Connecting the dots between resiliency planning and equity, which you've already talked about, and then thinking about what the co-benefits are of resilient infrastructure. So co-benefits as relates to safety, as relates to equity, as relates to health, et cetera. And the example on this page is actually a DVRPC, Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission map that they put together. And in this map, the sort of like fluorescent green are the vulnerable roadways, just as an example. Next slide. So I've talked a lot about the business case, and you might be wondering, well, why does she keep mentioning that? But I think this is all academic until you start to say, okay, well, right, well, why should I do this? What is, it's going to cost me more if I look at these scenarios, or if I open this Pandora's box and have this conversation, I better have a good, business case to explain why this is something that we should address, like why this is something that may incur additional cost, why this is something that may require that we create a different evacuation route or whatever. So, so an example on the right-hand side is from some work we've been doing with Miami Beach. So, and you can find lots of articles about this work, but we've been working with Miami Beach as they're thinking about their stormwater program. And so we've been, working with them to understand, okay, so if you are to make these incremental investments, which are going to be expensive and those costs are going to be passed on, what are the benefits, and what does it mean for me as a property owner? What does it mean for me as a resident? And this was one of the first times, and I'm not just saying this because we did it. This is one of the first times that we saw a very quantitative and detailed, specific economic analysis using, not just sort of like a cost benefit, sort of a vanilla cost benefit approach, which is usually not very applicable for climate related risks, partly because of the uncertainties and partly because of the timeframes. But we really dug in here, and the city of Miami Beach has been extremely grateful. The stakeholders have been really engaged, and that's the kind of role that an NJTPA could help sort of identify funding for consideration of the business case for specific issues that you think need to be evaluated, and evaluated in a very, this is not cheap to do, so they need to be, evaluated in a very thoughtful way. And then that, obviously, having that sophisticated and sort of a defensible business case then allows, in this case, allowed Miami Beach to go out and have conversations with developers and have conversations, but with real hard data in their back pocket, so that they could actually have a more sophisticated conversation and a more proactive and pragmatic sort of discussion about what the solutions might be. It also is more helpful when you're thinking about making the case for federal funding or state competitive state grants. I'm sorry, Melissa, we can keep going. Next one, this is easy enough to understand. So it's basically just, obviously, continued research in places where where you're seeing challenges, or where high level vulnerability assessments have identified that there may be a need for more detailed review. So the Passaic River Basin study, obviously you've already undertaken that. That was a great piece of work that has been done, and I think was able to be integrated into some of your your transportation plans. Thinking about the watershed level and corridor level vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. Again, I think it's so important that you be thinking about where the water goes, not where the political boundaries are, because that's where you're going to get hit. And so you have to figure out how do you swoop to the right level and then apply those kinds of planning studies to those levels. So I'll give you one example. We did some work in South Carolina. ICF did it. We didn't have a client for it, but we wanted to understand whether the tools that we were using for vulnerability assessment were effective at predicting the real outcomes from one of these storms. So there were some terrible floods in South Carolina a few years ago. We applied our tool, and our tool had been developed as part of a lot of work across all transportation modes over years. And what was amazing is that we absolutely predicted with great accuracy all of the flooding instances and the issues that came out of those floods, with one huge exception, which was that we don't been looking at transportation assets and transportation services. We had not been modeling dams. Well, if there's a dam failure, then there's a whole nother level and a whole nother vector, basically, of damage. And so thinking again, it was like, okay, we did a transportation vulnerability assessment, but we should have been thinking about what was happening with those dams, even though federal highways and our state DOTs weren't thinking necessarily about, well, and how do I assess the vulnerability of the dams? But when I'm trying to think as South Carolina, as Columbia, South Carolina, what am I going to do about climate change? I need to know about the dams. And then, considering providing resilience technical assistance and a program similar to the Complete Streets technical assistance that you already have, and then conducting climate change risk assessments on the economic impacts of sort of, well, what if we don't make a change? So what's the impact of not acting in this particular area? And maybe that makes sense for a certain period of time. Let's do this until this day, this till 2030, 2050, and then that's when we're going to do this other thing. And then making sure that you're thinking again about other asset types. I mentioned the dams and climate hazards. Okay, I have one more slide. I feel like I'm running long. I would think this would be high on the list for everybody right now, is figuring out, okay, well, what are all these funding opportunities? Which of the funding opportunities are well suited to the kinds of activities that we need, we feel we need to engage in? And how can NJTPA, or specific, municipalities be involved in putting together successful applications that are in line with, the goals of these specific programs. So this is just an overview of some of the programs we've been watching. So FEMA, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants, I'm sure you're well aware of, but the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities as BRIC grants, we've been talking about them for several years. I know there's a lot of activity in New Jersey around those. Department of Transportation obviously had FTA pilots. There's the RAISE program, there's an infra program. EPA has some programs that are focused on environmental justice, small grant programs, NOAA programs, and then also the Department of Defense OLDCC, which are those military installation resilience review opportunities, which I mentioned already. The one that we're doing in DC, I think there's several going on in San Diego, I think, is actually another place where they're using that information and thinking about, I think that an MPO is coordinating that work there as well.